History is full of amazing stories and memorable people.
But we don't care about them.
No hits, deep tracks only.
Some of the most influential people in the world have been completely overlooked or just plain forgotten.
We're digging deep into the history books to bring you their stories.
And maybe some laughs along the way.
This is History's B-Side.
Today's B-Sider is God's Rambo.
So with a name like God's Rambo, I feel like we don't need much to give us a more interesting start, but I wanted to start today out by asking you, given the amount of danger today's subject put himself in, what the most dangerous thing you've ever done is. And then a follow-up question after you answer that is what the most dangerous thing you'd consider doing is. So we've got a real-life question and then a hypothetical question.
Well, I grew up in Youngstown, Ohio, so I think every day is a dangerous day in my life. Not really.
Just bullets
we have a
whizzing by.
beautiful city. That's one of my biggest objections to people not from Youngstown is they're like, oh, Youngstown, you can get a mansion for $200,000. You're going to get shot in your front yard.
I mean, that's not really true at all.
No.
I feel like if
fine.
you drove down like Oak Hill Avenue every day at night, maybe you'd be in more danger.
There are definitely like quote unquote nicer cities that are more dangerous than the average place in Youngstown.
Absolutely. Oh yeah. I mean, I would 100 times over walk through at night the worst neighborhood in Youngstown over the worst neighborhood in New York or Miami or Chicago or LA. Like,
I mean, I probably
hands
wouldn't
down.
voluntarily walk through the worst neighborhood in any of those cities, including Youngstown,
Well,
at night.
fair.
But like most of Youngstown's okay, and downtown and things like that.
Yeah.
But as far as the most dangerous thing I've ever done, I am not much of a risk taker, I guess, so I don't really have any cool stories. I guess the only thing I had come up with was like when I was 16 and went to New Orleans, I was with a group, like a church group, and did this thing where we were standing around or walking around the city with a free hug sign trying to see how many people we could get hugs from, which like probably really wasn't that dangerous because it was a huge national church youth group thing. So like most of them were just other teenage kids, but there were some strangers too. And that, I mean, in hindsight, probably could have been a dangerous situation. But
yeah. Well, I mean, I guess that's what I assumed would be a story of yours and mine too. Like, I don't think either one of us actively has chosen highly dangerous situations. Like mine would probably be traveling to Italy alone. And at the end of the day, like I was never that in danger, but
yeah, I mean, when we went to Venice, it was nighttime by the time we got there. By the time we got off our train and we're trying to find our hotel, and you've been to Venice, it's literally a maze. Like it's so hard to know where you're going, especially if you've never been there before and it's pitch black out. But it was never like, I don't know, it didn't feel unsafe at any point.
Right.
Maybe that's just
that's
cultural
I mean, that
thing.
is like everybody I talk to, and I don't know how much I agree. I mean, I guess conceptually I agree. I didn't experience the same thing, but everybody I talk to says that Paris and Venice and Rome are the most dangerous places in Europe because they're tourist traps.
Yeah, I could see that.
So the people who want to prey on Americans and tourists just flock there versus like small towns where nobody speaks English, which might seem more dangerous, but really aren't because nobody there cares.
Right.
Like they're not there to take advantage of you. But I mean, I agree with that. There are definitely times where I don't know that I didn't intentionally put myself in danger, but I could see like given a couple bad decisions or just wrong place, wrong time kind of things where I could have certainly been in a rough spot.
And we're definitely speaking from a place where there's probably a lot of people who are different than us that would feel more uncomfortable in situations. By which I mean, we're white adult males who can kind of just go places without being too worried about our situations.
Right. So, what's the most dangerous thing you'd consider doing? Like, off the top of your head,
Voluntarily?
that like, I mean, maybe not voluntarily. Like, I guess voluntarily, yes. But
I mean,
what's the most dangerous? What's the worst thing you would allow yourself to do, even given some like pressure? I guess.
voluntarily, I wouldn't be opposed to, I don't know, whitewater rafting on a dangerous rapid or maybe skydiving or something like that. But if you're talking about, I don't know, putting myself in harm's way, I wouldn't really want to be on the front lines of an army battle or something like that. But if, the draft was reinstated, I suppose there's a scenario where that might be my fate.
I'm glad you brought that up because our topic today, Helge Meyer, actually drove a 1979 Camaro through a war zone for several years to deliver aid. Would you consider doing that?
Yeah, that's just a joyride, right?
Yeah, it's exactly what that is. So today's topic is Helge Meyer and the Ghost Camaro. And before we get into the specifics of his feats, I'd like to, give a little bit of background on the Bosnian War. I found it interesting that, to stop for a moment, Helge Meyer was one of the people that when we started this podcast, I saw first. And I have to give credit to the blog Badass of the Week, because that's where I actually found his name. And if you're not familiar with it, it's a blog that basically tells these stories of all these, people in history that did these overwhelming feats that kind of seem superhuman. But I didn't think he fit into the History's B-side idea enough to be one of our first episodes. So I saved him for a little bit later. But I had to tell the story because it's just so cool and it's just fun. And I feel like we've had a lot of stressful, sad topics lately. So I wanted to do something that was a little bit more fun and upbeat.
Good. So there won't be anything sad or horrible or inhumane in this episode?
Just genocide and rape, but
oh, good.
Only
the
a little
basics.
bit. The basics.
History sucks,
I realized,
man.
while doing this, there's just no way you can talk about history without talking about sad, despicable things. Human beings are rough. We're a rough species, man.
This podcast was supposed to be fun.
Instead, it's just depressing every week. So in the course of researching this, I realized that not only is Helge Meyer a good B-sider, but the Bosnian War in itself is kind of a B-sider because despite the fact that this was going on during and for the first few years after our birth, I know nothing about it. I knew to a degree that the Balkan Peninsula had conflict, but that's as specific as my statement got.
Yeah, it doesn't get a lot of attention in the American education of world history.
Well, that's because we weren't, outside of being an aid provider and kind of a backer of certain sides, we weren't really involved. But the Bosnian War is kind of an interesting topic because it was one of the most bloody and violent war crime-ridden conflicts since World War II. And it began in 1992 after the breakup of what was called the Socialist Federal Republic of Yugoslavia. Now, Yugoslavia is, of course, on the Balkan Peninsula, and it formed after World War II. Prior to that being the Kingdom of Yugoslavia, which was essentially the same region, but World War II, it was occupied by Axis forces from Italy and Germany, and afterwards was reformed as this federal republic. And it contained at the time, after the Second World War, 6 republics, which were Slovenia, Croatia, Serbia, Bosnia and Herzegovina, which are the same state. Bosnia and Herzegovina are one state, and then Montenegro and Macedonia. So pretty much everything north of Greece up to Austria. And this area was really kind of fraught with a lot of ethnic tension. It's in a part of the world that's often said of, you have all of these different ethnic groups, including Muslims and Catholics, that mixed and mingled.
It's funny that you mention all these nations and even just Yugoslavia in itself. I remember, obviously this happened in the early years of our own lives, but I remember being in school and looking at world maps and Yugoslavia was still labeled as one country. Now, when you look at the map, you have these 6 different nations or however, that are just individually sovereign and have their own borders and everything. But there were still in our
Right.
own history books when we were in school, Yugoslavia was on the map. Maybe they just were just out of date by a few years, but definitely is memorable from our lifetime.
Yeah, any map that was made before 1991 would have had Yugoslavia as its own nation. So you've got this chunk of land that is kind of rife for political and ethnic strife, and it was part of what was called. I mean, this is kind of a fun fact. It doesn't have much to do with the war, but it was part of what was called the non-alignment movement, which was essentially a group of small burgeoning countries that weren't aligned with major superpowers. So, as a lot of us know, the Soviet Union had all of these ally countries that were also communist, and the United States and much of Western Europe had all of these other countries that were aligned with them. Despite being a socialist republic, Yugoslavia wasn't aligned with, the communist USSR.
Was there a reason for that? Was it, I mean, similar ideology, or why weren't they working together?
There were definitely more communist ideologies there. I don't know that there was a specific reason for it. That didn't necessarily come up in my research. My guess is that there was just so many different ideologies in this region that they found it best to not participate in the overall conflict. They were also a very small, kind of inconsequential region after the Second World War. So I don't know that they were a target for larger world powers to get involved in influencing. Now, make no mistake, these world powers did become an influence during the Bosnian War, but we will get to that. So you've got this country that forms after World War II. Under its first president, President Tito, it was actually pretty calm. He was a very anti-nationalist leader, and he encouraged all of these different groups, these different republics to cooperate. But after his death, during the 1980s, the country kind of fell into economic collapse. And this led to a lot of ethnic tensions and nationalism among the 6 republics that I mentioned. After his death, the republics kind of fall apart. They start to collapse in on one another. And being the not the biggest necessarily, but the most powerful of them, Serbia started to flex its political muscle. And one of the things it did is it amended its constitution. So Serbia, if you're not familiar with the geography, is on the eastern side of what would be Yugoslavia. So just east of Croatia and Bosnia and Herzegovina. So it actually splits into 3 separate regions. 2 autonomous regions come off of it. In the north, Vojvodina, and in the south, Kosovo. So it basically splits into 3. And so it controls 3 votes, and in addition controls a 4th vote, which is Montenegro. And so you've got this republic, which is now 8 votes deep, and Serbia essentially controls 4 of those. So an overwhelming amount of political imbalance towards Serbia. It also had one of the strongest militaries of the republics. And due to this imbalance of power, further tensions start to increase. Now, it's important to mention, and we'll come back to this multiple times, but many of these countries, including Croatia and including Bosnia and Herzegovina, have a mix of Serbians, Croats, and Bosniaks. So everybody's kind of living in different pockets. So it's not like Serbians are all in Serbia. They're kind of thrown all over the region, which contributes to the conflict later on.
And I'm looking at a map here of, I guess, what would have been Yugoslavia at the time. And Bosnia and Herzegovina is just kind of in the middle of the entire thing. So it's really just, whether it had anything to do with their own politics or whatever, you have this coalition of Serbia and Kosovo and Montenegro and everything, that the only way to get to the rest of Yugoslavia is through Bosnia and Herzegovina, which really kind of forced them into the middle of this conflict.
Exactly. And, it is also one, like I just mentioned, there are these different ethnic groups strewn around. It was one of the most divided. So, before we get to the different secessions from this federation, Bosnia and Herzegovina was made up of Muslim Bosniaks, which were the what I guess you would call the local people. And then you had Orthodox Catholic Serbs and Catholic Croats. So you had Serbs, Croats, and then Bosniaks all within this same country, and they lived in different pockets, and these pockets weren't, perfect lines like states would be. They were intermixed, there were pockets secluded, and this led later to a lot of really bloody and violent conflict. But the first thing to start this was after the Serbian government starts to take over more control, Croatia and Slovenia, which is the furthest north part republic, I guess, of Yugoslavia, just underneath Austria, they both secede in 1991. So they leave the Federation, declare their own independence. And then shortly after that, in February of 1992, this region that we've discussed, which was at the time called the Socialist Republic of Bosnia and Herzegovina, declared its own independence. So this is the region I was talking about that has all of these different ethnic groups mixed in. And this obviously was a problem for Serbian forces. Their purpose, their goal was to keep Yugoslavia together. They held all the power. And so in a weird way, this is, I guess, akin to the secession of the southern states in the United States. Like, not the same issue, clearly, but...
Yeah, but you have the I guess, northern states who may disagree ideologically with the southern states, but it benefits them to remain one united nation.
Right.
Just strictly for political power and population and resources. So it makes sense for them to want to keep it together, even if they don't necessarily like each other.
Exactly. I mean, Yugoslavia, controlled by Serbia, with Croatia and Slovenia and Bosnia and Herzegovina, was better than a Yugoslavia without those. Obviously, the Serbian forces have a problem with this. And so the war initially starts once Bosnia and Herzegovina decides to secede and declare its independence. And so Serbian forces start fighting against an allied group of Bosnian and Croatian forces. This gets even more complicated when in 1992, at the start of the war, the allied Bosnian and Croatian forces begin fighting with each other as well. So now you've got three different groups fighting with each other. You got Croatian forces, Bosnian forces, and Serbian forces. Now, this luckily ended 3 years into the war in 1994 with what was called the Washington Agreement, which essentially brought the Croatian and Bosnian forces together and allied them against the Serbians.
Why was it called the Washington Agreement?
It was signed in Washington, D.C. That was it. It was under the Clinton administration. The United States wasn't directly involved. There were many countries that were involved in backing financially and economically different sides, including delivering aid. But one of the things that was bad about this conflict is that there were so many different sides that almost all other powerful countries were kind of afraid to get directly involved because it was a powder keg. I mean, the United States didn't have enough stakes there to go to physical war because it would anger a bunch of other nations that it was, not at war with, but not friendly with. So, and that was true for dozens of nations. It just wasn't worth it to go into this region and directly fight.
Yeah, I mean, as I was reading through your sort of notes here about what we were going to talk about today, it was kind of hard to follow. I mean, I can kind of understand why we're not really taught this in school, because there are a lot of different sides to it, and it's hard to really know who's in the right here and who's fighting who. And
right.
It would be understandably difficult for the United States or any of these other more powerful nations to pick one side, because then you're immediately ruining any ally or relationship you had with the others, and it's
exactly
kind of hard to know what the moral side is here.
Well, I think it's as, if not more complicated than the conflicts in the Middle East. There's all these different, it's not just nations against nations. You've got ethnicities against other ethnicities. And, even outside of Bosnia and Herzegovina, there were Serbian people, citizens of Croatia, that Serbia wanted to control and get back. So, there's so many different levels to the conflict. It wasn't just, a classic war like, France versus England. There were like dozens of different groups. And there were even, this created such unrest that there were even smaller bandit groups that weren't a part of any national militia or military that decided to fight. I mean, it was, I guess, akin to what we see sometimes in Africa, where governments are so destabilized, or even in the Middle East, where governments are so destabilized that you just have civilian populations and very, very large gangs starting to have enough power to fight back. So, I mean, it was an extraordinarily messy conflict. And it continues now that, I mean, we've got Croatian Bosnians back together fighting the Serbians, which does tip the scale a little bit. I mean, the Serbians remained the kind of powerhouse throughout the war. They were clearly the ones with more military might. But in 1995, NATO-led Operation Deliberate Force, which I love these names. I want to know who names these. But this Operation Deliberate Force targets specific Serbian army positions and kind of balances the power out. And this leads to them forcing kind of a peace treaty, which was signed in Paris in late 1995. But it was actually, I mean, to give a little bit of local connection to you and I, being from Ohio, the terms of this agreement were actually negotiated in Dayton, Ohio.
Why Dayton?
So, I mean, the only reason I could find was because it was so far away and kind of obscure that it prevented the different sides from using the media to negotiate and force them to only negotiate at the meeting.
That's still so random. Like, there's got to be so many different cities.
Well, there's an Air Force base in Dayton, too. I don't know if that
okay.
adds any. I mean, that was where it was done, at the Air Force base in Dayton, not just at like a coffee shop.
Why not Vienna, Ohio? A little closer to us.
I don't know. So these things are called the Dayton Accords, and they're signed in Paris in late 1995, about a month after they're negotiated in Ohio. And this essentially ends the conflict and leads to the borders we have now, which are Slovenia, Croatia, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Serbia, Kosovo, and then Macedonia and Montenegro in the south. So those are the present day countries that exist. And this is essentially a ceasefire. But it's still, I mean, the aftermath was kind of crazy. I mean, it was one of the most devastating conflicts in Europe since World War II. In 2008, the International Criminal Tribunal for former Yugoslavia, which was held in The Hague, found 45 Serbs, 12 Croats, and 4 Bosniaks guilty of war crimes. So all sides clearly heavily Serbian on the war crime side, but like still, I mean, each side was committing what would be considered international war crimes. The bitter fighting killed an estimated 100,000 people over the 4 years the war went on, and it displaced over 2 million people.
Wow.
In addition, and this is where it kind of gets depressing and war crimey, an estimated 12 to 15,000 women were raped. And this was mainly carried out by Serb forces against Bosniaks.
Goodness
so
gracious.
A majority of the war crimes were committed by Serbs against the Bosniak Muslim population.
I just don't get... I get that it's wartime. I don't get why rape is such a big part of war. Like, you hear about it in other conflicts and stuff too, and it just doesn't make sense, I guess.
Yeah. Well, this is certainly, of course, not to defend genocide in any way, but it's just part of the genocide playbook, you know. The whole goal is to completely culturally destroy a people, and I mean, the raping is just, I guess, the violent part of it. The violent part that, I mean, not that we don't hear about that, but I guess that isn't as difficult to hear. It means they set up ghettos like this. They destroyed their culture. They made it illegal to be Muslim in some parts of Bosnia. It's this entire process of culturally wiping out a people. And that did lead to essentially convictions of genocide. And part of that was that this war was characterized in part by this indiscriminate bombing and shelling of cities, which contained civilian populations. It wasn't just like battles between two different military forces. They bombed cities with people in them, just, indiscriminately. They just put artillery fire and bombs into cities. And the one battle, if you want to call it that, that kind of epitomized this was the Siege of Sarajevo, which is considered the longest siege of a capital city in modern warfare. And it lasted 1,425 days, from April 1992 to February 1996. A capital city was under siege.
Sarajevo is the capital of Bosnia and Herzegovina?
Bosnia and Herzegovina. Yeah. There are pictures you can look up online. If you just look up the Siege of Sarajevo, the first thing you'll see is this council building that's on fire because it was hit by tank artillery. Like, I mean, it really was a terrible conflict. If anybody's familiar with the Battle of Stalingrad or Leningrad during World War II, which were two extraordinarily devastating and long battles between the Axis and Soviet powers, it was 3 times longer than Stalingrad and a year longer than Leningrad. So, and this isn't even like a battle between military forces. It's just people in a city. It's like DC without, I mean, just including the military, but also including not the military, being under siege for 4 years with artillery fire and mines and bombs going off. In this siege, 13,000 people are killed, and almost half of them, over 5,000 of them, were civilians. So this is part of this overwhelming evidence towards these war crimes. And then, I mean, I mentioned genocide and ethnic cleansing, but the, I guess, iconic version of that for this war was what was called the Massacre of Srebrenica, which is a town in Bosnia and Herzegovina, which is mainly Muslim. And in this town, an estimated 8,000 Muslim men and boys were killed.
They only killed the males? What about the women?
Yeah, I mean, the women were raped.
Oh.
It's part of that 12 to 15,000. It's not just the women either. It's children and elderly too that were, I mean, not necessarily raped, but captured, forced into slavery.
I'm glad you
many
kind
of them were sent.
Sort of introduced the main topic of this episode earlier, because for the people gritting their teeth through this first section, section 2 is a lot more fun.
It gets way more fun.
Just skip ahead if you need to, but this part's rough. It gets better.
So, I guess, I mean, to wrap this up, because we don't need to talk about rape and genocide for any longer.
Yeah.
Due to the chaos of this war, like I mentioned earlier, many nations were kind of hesitant to get involved, and even the UN didn't really do a great job of getting involved. You know, the UN actually declared these safe zones within Bosnia and Herzegovina, but they were poorly defended, and they didn't do a good job of demilitarizing them. In fact, Srebrenica, where the massacre took place, was declared a safe zone at the time of a massacre. So it's like, if genocide is possible inside your safe zone, is it a safe zone? And one of the problems, and this kind of sets us up for Helge Meyer's story, is that these aid convoys from the UN and from NATO, from assisting countries, were just, I mean, they were trucks and tanks full of stuff. So they were slow targets. They were easily attacked and commandeered. Like I mentioned, there were all these groups of bandits and different gangs that were attacking as well as the militarized forces. So, I mean, they were most often robbed or attacked, and the aid just didn't get to the populations that needed them. And
yeah, they were just aiding the attackers.
Right. I mean, many countries just stopped sending aid at all because the aid never got where it was supposed to go. And this left the civilians in the war zones without supplies, without food, water, shelter, medical supplies. And many of them starved and froze to death during this war. And it was a horrific humanitarian crisis.
Yeah. Just the civilians we're talking about, not even actual soldiers, just innocent people.
Right. Yeah, I mean, you consider like all of these, the genocide and the civilian attacks, this is on top of the 100,000 casualties estimated. So, I mean, a huge crisis and not many people able to do much about it. And this is where Helge Meyer kind of takes things into his own hands. But before we get into that, we'll give you guys a break, catch your breath, go get a drink.
I'm going to take a shower.
And we'll be back right after this with a little bit more positive material.
When we decided to make a podcast, the first thing we did was download Anchor.
Because we have no money, and Anchor is free.
You can also record and edit your podcast right from your phone or a computer.
Then, it only takes one click to share your podcast to Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and more.
And because we have no money, Anchor helps pair us with advertisers and lets our listeners support the History's B-Side podcast directly on our page.
If you've got an idea for your own podcast, download the free Anchor app or go to anchor.fm to get started. All right, welcome back. If you've held on with us this long, you've gotten through the hard part. The next half hour will be a little bit more enlightening.
History sucks, man. Why do we do this to ourselves?
I don't know. I'm just sad.
History's fun. People suck.
But yeah, that's true. But we do have Helge Meyer to hold on to. So today's B-Sider is a really interesting character. There's not a lot of backstory on him, and I'm going to be honest, because his main tool is a souped up Camaro, I got a lot of the information on him from car magazine articles, and that's one of the main sources on him on the internet. So this guy is a Danish ex-special forces officer, so he's got some military experience and knowledge of Europe and different regions, but he's also a deeply religious man. And after seeing a news story on the television about starving Yugoslavian children, he's kind of compelled to take things into his own hands. So he decides he's going to offer aid himself. He does approach the UN to offer his service, but he's turned down. Now, his idea is to drive, from the beginning, his idea is to drive through Bosnia and Herzegovina in a Camaro delivering aid. So it's kind of a wacky idea to begin with.
I was going to ask you why the UN said no to letting him help. But I'm just imagining the scenario where he walks in and says, I don't know how you approach the UN, but I'm just imagining him walking into the floor of the UN and saying, hey guys, I got my Camaro out in the parking lot. How would you feel if I just drove it through the war zone and dropped off some supplies to people? And they're like, get out. Someone call security.
They thought he was batshit crazy. So he does what any sensible person wanting to drive a Chevrolet Camaro through a war zone would do, and he drives it to the U.S. Air Force Base in Frankfurt, Germany.
Of course.
And it's here that the U.S. Air Force mechanics and engineers happily turned his Camaro into essentially what was a 220 horsepower tank. So
American muscle car? Hell yeah! USA! USA!
They take this 1979 Chevrolet Camaro, they strip it down to its essentials on its chassis, and they start by adding an armor plating to the body and rear window and Kevlar inserts into the doors. So all of this is essentially bulletproof. It makes much of the car bulletproof. Then they turn to the engine and they tune it from its stock 180 horsepower to 280 horsepower. And on top of that, they add a nitrous oxide system. For anybody who's seen Fast and the Furious, you should be familiar with this. And this system essentially would temporarily give the engine 440 horsepower, so double its horsepower, to help him get out of a jam if need be.
Just in case.
If this wasn't enough, they add run-flat tires and a landmine clearing blade, as well as a ram bar to the front of the vehicle.
Of course.
And then inside the car, they add, in order to help him navigate, a military-grade GPS, thermal imaging system, and ground-to-air frequency radio, so he could communicate with air support, along with, a high-tech fire extinguishing system. Like most cars.
Right. The necessities.
Right. In order to make the car stealthy and able to avoid and evade conflict, all the lights inside and on the outside of the car were removed, and the entire thing was painted with this matte black thermal and radar resistant stealth paint. Like all of us can get on our Chevrolet Camaros. And this essentially allowed him to operate the car in complete darkness, using only a pair of night vision goggles to see. Now, in reading this, I don't have a problem driving. And I don't have a problem driving at night, but the idea of driving with night vision goggles for some reason just gives me anxiety. Even on a highway in America, let alone a war zone.
One time on a family vacation, we were driving through the Blue Ridge Parkway. I don't know if you've ever been down there. Very scenic, very pretty, but you're driving basically through Appalachian Mountains, and there's all these tunnels that go through the mountains. And my dad, thinking he's hilarious, is wearing his sunglasses as we're driving. And then we go into this tunnel and he they're very short for the most part. Like these tunnels are very short. You can see the end of them before you even get into them. But this one tunnel was a
Yeah.
lot longer than he expected it to be. And he drove into it and he's like, "Whoa, why did it get all dark all of a sudden?" And we're like, "Are you still wearing your sunglasses?" And he was like, "Oh." So by the time he realizes and takes the sunglasses off, we're pretty much out of the tunnel. But he's like, "Yeah, I couldn't really see when we were going through that one."
Jesus. He should have had night vision goggles.
Yeah, why not?
He'd have been fine.
Must have left him
Or
at home that
blinded.
day.
I don't know how. So, I mean, definitely a souped up car, decked out, and even full of its estimated 1,000 kilograms of supplies that it could take, it could still accelerate to 125 miles per hour in 13 seconds, which sure as shit is better than any car I've owned.
Like, this whole car just sounds so ridiculous. And by nature of my day job, I tend to interact with a lot of car guys, classic cars and customized cars, and even dealing with some car magazines and stuff. And, like, there are two types of car guys. The customization guys are looking at this like, "This is awesome. I am doing this to my car. I will find a way. I'm going to put all this stuff into my car. I'm going to make this happen." And then the classic car guys are hearing this, and this is just like, you murdered their child. Like, just completely
they're
ruined.
purists.
Yeah. Someone has
Purists.
the original 1979 Chevy Camaro and is just
As
dying listening to this, imagining doing this to their car.
You know what? If their car got hit with a mortar, it'd be in pieces in total, and his just kept rolling. So he basically gets this thing decked out by the U.S. military. This is what's that show on MTV that they used to do? It's like Pimp My Ride. This is the military. Yeah, this is the military's version of Pimp My Ride. And to say it's a tank, a 220 horsepower tank, is not really an exaggeration.
So why was the Air Force so willing to do all this?
I mean, over the UN, I don't have a direct answer, but I'm going to, in a personal way, go back to a phrase my dad always says when he insists that Americans are different from the rest of the world in one way. And it's true of all American citizens. And it's this attitude, I guess, or a tenacity, and it's this, I guess, I don't know, tendency to just say screw you to the rules and do whatever the hell you were going to do anyway. And I don't know, as this is pure opinion, exclaimer, but I think the United States Air Force was just stoked to trick out this Camaro for this crazy Dutch special forces dude.
And it's the U.S. military, so they have unlimited budget to do it.
Well, and the thing is, when he was going around, he actually introduced himself as Mr. Meyer from the U.S. Army, but he technically wasn't representing any country. So I guess it was kind of a slick way for people to get around. You know, like I said, there was a lot of threat to being involved in this crisis, and he was I guess, low risk in a way person to give aid through. Because, like, I mean,
It's his own car, and he's not an American citizen. If he dies doing this, they don't
yeah,
care.
I mean, his car didn't say U.S. Army on it.
Right.
His car was black. He wasn't wearing a uniform.
Did he have to pay them to, put all these improvements, should we call them, on his car?
There's no accounts of him paying them. In fact, they were the ones that requisitioned the nearly $12,000 in aid supplies for his first run.
Jeez.
So, no, nobody mentions him paying them anything. Interestingly enough, at Helge's request, the car wasn't outfitted with any weapons at all. No offensive weapons whatsoever.
But why wouldn't he want any weapons on it? I mean, obviously he's going through a war zone, and he's got all these defenses added to his car. Why no weapons?
Yeah. So I think the no weapons thing is kind of the pinnacle, not the pinnacle, but the main thing about his mission and his message. He was offered a bulletproof Kevlar suit and helmet, which he accepted. But in addition to not outfitting his car with any weapons, he denied a gun that he was offered to take as protection. insisting that his pocket knife and his Bible were the only protection he needed. Now, like I said, he was a deeply religious man, and he insisted that the Bible and his guardian angels and God were the only things he needed for protection.
It reminds me of it's in Ephesians where they talk about the full armor of God. It says, "Wherefore take unto you the whole armor of God, that ye may be able to withstand in the evil day, and having done all to stand. Stand therefore, having your loins girt about with truth, and having on the breastplate of righteousness, and your feet shod with the preparation of the gospel of peace. Above all, take the shield of faith, wherewith ye shall be able to quench the fiery darts of the wicked, and take the helmet of salvation and the sword of the Spirit, which is the word of God, praying always with all prayer and supplication in the Spirit, and watching thereunto with all perseverance and supplication for all saints. And don't forget your pocket knife."
That's in the Bible, right?
Yeah, I'm
And
pretty
don't forget
sure
your pocket
that's how that verse ends. Pocket knife, full armor of God, the helmet of salvation and the shield of faith and the pocket knife of righteousness.
And yeah, I mean, I think I'm glad you brought that up, because he really did believe that he was protected. I don't buy that he drove into a war zone without a weapon if he didn't. And this is part of, I think, his entire mission. Like, he was a man of God. He was a religious man. And
it's a testament to his faith.
Yeah, not just in his insistence to take no weapons, but in his decision to do this at all. I consider myself a pretty compassionate, philanthropic person, and I feel like I have a lot of empathy for people, but I got to admit, there's no way, and again, I'm not as equipped as I think an ex-Special Forces officer would be to drive into a war zone, but there's no way in hell I would drive into a war zone to deliver aid. I mean, I'd be the guy writing checks to like an aid service or writing to my congressman, but not driving a car through a war zone.
I mean, how many people in our age group and society are watching these atrocities happening and thinking, that's terrible, I should do something. And the extent of what we do is, post something on Facebook or Twitter about how terrible it is and someone should do something. No one is thinking, I'm going to drive my own car into the war zone and help these people out.
Yeah, I mean, he clearly had something beyond even a special forces officer's bravery. And I think that came from his faith. And, I think that, I don't know that the verse you read was his specific inspiration, but I think it's part of the idea that he had in that, he was going to do what he considered God's work.
At the very least, he felt protected and that he was called to do something more than stand idly by and watch this happen.
Right. And, to his credit, he was effective. I mean, despite all of the danger that he went through, this souped up Camaro was very effective. It pretty much remained undetected from police and military forces when he was, kind of underground between missions. And even while running supply runs, he was, he wasn't killed. He was shot on numerous occasions and chased. And he even took a bullet to that helmet that he accepted. But he largely evaded conflict and capture. And part of this is due to the fact that, I didn't mention it before, but the UN trucks, the UN trucks and tanks bringing in the aid were painted white with red crosses on them. So they weren't stealth vehicles.
And a big sign that said, "Capture me, intercept me. I'm full of supplies."
Yeah. So, I mean, a black stealth Camaro was probably better.
Driving only at night with no headlights on.
Right. It was probably better at evading, but he's still, he's one guy driving through these war-torn streets, and he clearly was chased and shot at and managed to never get killed and never be captured. And he was really successful. He completed hundreds of supply runs throughout the course of the war. And even after it was over, he continued delivering supplies for almost a decade into 2005. And over the course of the war, delivered over 1,000 pounds of gear to people. So, he had a decade-long career driving this thing around this war zone. And so, you can't really fault him for his faith in a way, because it worked.
He was successful. He did.
Yeah, he was successful.
He set out to do this thing, and he did it.
Yeah. So, due to this intense bravery and, coupled with pacifism and religious faith, he was given the nickname God's Rambo.
That's an awesome nickname.
Yeah, I mean, he gave a speech to a group of people describing his efforts, and he kind of self-ordained himself as God's Rambo, but I don't think anybody's going to fault him for giving himself that name because, he did all of this stuff in the name of his faith and was successful. And he actually even wrote a book named Gods Rambo, which is Dutch for God's Rambo. Unfortunately, this book isn't in English, so anybody who speaks German and Dutch, go ahead and buy the book and read about it and tell us about it.
And translate it, and then send us your translated copy.
But yeah, I mean, he really kind of embodied this idea. And I guess, I mean, even though I can't give you the entire book, there is an excerpt that's translated into English that I'll repeat here for you. He says, "In the middle of ruins, I examined the surrounding area with my detector, which reacts to body heat, of course, and it displayed body heat in the opposite ruin. I saw candlelight through the boarded up door, and I knocked, and the candle went out immediately. After knocking again and saying, 'Mr. Meyer, U.S. Army,' an old man opened up the door and asked me inside. A young woman was present with her newborn baby. Everyone was dirty and clearly malnourished, so I got soap, water, food, and baby food from my Camaro. The young mother washed herself and her child and gave the newborn something to eat. We sat around the candles silent for a while. The old man read carefully from his Quran, and I from my Bible, which is my constant companion." So this is an excerpt from his book. So I think this clearly displays both his faith and also his mission to, indiscriminately help people of all faiths, given that this specific excerpt references a Muslim man reading his Quran.
Yeah, he's literally a modern day Good Samaritan. I don't mean to get on a Christian soapbox here, but I actually did give a sermon at my church a couple months ago on the Good Samaritan reading, and he's embodying these Christ-like examples of sacrificing to help his neighbor. It's not just whoever's convenient to him to help or people that are like him, but he is a Christian who's literally sacrificing or risking his life to help his Muslim neighbor.
Right.
I was going to dig back into another scripture that specifically about the Good Samaritan story. It's where Jesus is telling the parable of the Good Samaritan in Luke chapter 10. He says that you should love the Lord your God with all your heart and soul and strength and mind, and love your neighbors yourself. And he says, do this and you will live. And a young man who's trying to understand him says, well, who is my neighbor? And Jesus then tells the parable of the Good Samaritan, which is, if you know the story, obviously it's a Samaritan who went to help a battered and bruised Hebrew who had, wasn't of the same faith, wasn't of the same economic level, or he was just someone who was in need of help. And that's really the mindset that Helge Meyer had in this situation. He wasn't just reaching out to help Christians in need. He wasn't reaching out to help other Danish people in need or people of the same wealth level as him. He was a Christian, a Danish Christian man helping poor, struggling Muslim children, Yugoslavian children who were in these horrible, horrible situations by no fault of their own. And he saw that there was a need and he risked his life to go help these people. It epitomizes what we're taught to do as Christians. And as someone of faith, I look at him as an example of why are we not sharing his story in churches? Why aren't we going to do this? It's so easy, especially as an American, for us to go help other Americans and other impoverished people. But this is a literal example of someone who's going to act on his faith and what he's taught to do because of his faith. He felt that this was right because of his faith. Sorry, I'll get off of that.
No, I mean, I think it's a really good point. And I even especially today where not just in our country, but I think in a lot of countries, there's this sense of nationalism, which borders on, I think, a dangerous disregard for the welfare of other human beings. I think he's a good example, whether you want to take it from a Christian perspective or not, like, he went on his own accord and helped people who were in need. And it's just not something that I see commonly in today's culture, at least not to this degree. And I don't expect, the average person to drive a Camaro through a war zone, but I think there's little
But you
things
don't have to.
we can all do.
Right.
No, you can embody that philosophy without the risk, I think, in a lot of ways that are far easier to do from the comfort
Right.
of your couch.
Need is not defined by geopolitical borders or income levels or whatever. People are in need, people need help, and this is an example of someone who recognized that need and in whatever way he was able to do, helped. Not everyone can go do this, but it was a skill set that he had, and he made the step of going to the U.S. Air Force to have them give him the resources he needed to accomplish this goal. And I mean, he clearly was a success story. This is just an amazing guy who, his story's not told enough.
He's even still alive. He actually currently lives in Germany, and in fact, he still drives the Ghost Camaro, which at this point in time is actually painted orange. Allegedly has over 100,000 miles put on it, which kind of seems short to me given how much use he got out of it. But I mean, the guy's still alive. He's got a book. I definitely encourage people to look up pictures of the car, which obviously as a podcast we can't include, but it's a pretty sick looking vehicle. I wouldn't mind driving it.
We can post some pictures on our social media feeds once this episode gets published. So follow us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. We'll definitely post pictures of this Camaro. But I mean, it's a cool guy. And you said he's still alive, still lives in Germany. This will, I think, be our first episode about a living person.
Whoop whoop! Somebody didn't die. Yay, history!
But that's pretty cool. I mean, this is such a cool story, and like you said, it's even hard to find research on him outside of a couple car magazines that are you're really just focusing on the details of the car.
I literally, I used 7 different car magazine articles to research for this, and outside of that, it was mainly just research on the Bosnian Wars that had nothing to do with him. So all of the information on the car and him and his actions pretty much came from car magazines, which is cool in and of itself. But
I mean, it's kind of a cool story too, because a lot of the people that we've even talked about on this podcast are people that have cool stories and are on some level inspirational, but they also have their bad sides to them too. Like we talked about even in our first episode, Edith Wilson was someone that came from a family that still believed in the justification of the lost cause when it came to slavery, or some of the atrocities that Bartolomé de las Casas participated in before he had his come to light realization, or Jing Shi herself wasn't the sweetheart that she did some pretty bad things too, but this guy really seemed to have pure intentions and acted on them to make a difference.
I don't know that you can fault him in any way. Like I can't pick out one thing he did wrong. The biggest thing I can pick out, and this is so nitpicky that it's a joke, is that he got some free car upgrades from the U.S. Air Force that he didn't pay for.
That's a win too.
God forbid. You can't fault him really for any of his actions. And I think that's the most impressive thing about him, is that he managed to do this feat and save people and make a positive impact with zero negative impact.
It's kind of amazing that Chevy isn't making a bigger deal out of this guy. Tell his story.
Right?
He's using your product to do this amazing thing.
Yeah.
And this was 25 years ago now? Come on, Chevy. Get on this. Make a movie out of this
The Camaro is a currently produced car.
Right.
They brought it back and started reproducing it. You'd think this would have been
and he still drives it.
Contact us, Chevy, if you want some marketing ideas for your Camaro.
Yes, we are not bashing Chevy. In case you want to invest some sponsorship dollars in this show, Matt has driven many a Chevys in his life. I drove one, but I got some gripes about that. But if you'd like to Chevrolet sponsor this episode, or Ford if you want to sponsor, we'll just completely bash Chevy on our next episode. So hit us up. Historiesbside@gmail.com.
Honestly, if anybody's willing to offer an upgrade for radar resistant matte black paint and a mine wedge, I'll buy that car.
You know that's going to be on a future Subaru.
Hey, you know what? The way things are going, you might need it soon.
All right, you ready for some quiz questions?
I'm as ready as I think I can be. I feel like they're either going to be Camaro based or Bosnian War based, and either one I'm poorly prepared for. So
Let's find out.
we'll be right back.
We just want to take a minute and thank you for listening to History's B-Side. You know, it takes a lot of time to research and put these episodes together, so we wanted to let you know how you can support the show going forward.
Go ahead and subscribe at anchor.fm/History's B-Side or wherever you're listening from. If you'd like, leave us a review and tell us what you think of our show.
If you're interested in advertising with the show and hearing your message in a spot like this, send us an email to historiesbside@gmail.com.
We're looking forward to hearing from you, and thanks for listening.
All right, now it's time for today's quiz. We end every episode with a short 3-question quiz to kind of test today's host's knowledge of its topic, and maybe you, the listeners, are following along or know something about it that you might be able to answer some of these questions as well. You ready?
Whoop, whoop. Yes, sir.
I kind of themed these questions for you. So
Ooh.
Today's quiz is the theme, what's that name?
What's that name?
All these questions will
I feel like this is
be
gonna be hard.
a name.
Okay.
Question number 1. What does the name Yugoslavia mean?
Oh, Lord. Oh, no. Oh, my God, I don't know. This is terrible.
It's kind of simple and obvious, I guess, but not really. You won't know it, I guess. It just means land of the South Slavs. So, like, the countries
Okay.
in the southern part of the Slavic peninsula.
That's fair.
But it makes sense because it's just a big collective nation of those countries.
Yeah. 0 for 1. Wah, wah.
Question number 2. Helge Meyer was a member of a Danish special forces unit composed of around 150 highly trained soldiers with special expertise in counterterrorism, demolitions, parachuting and combat, swimming, infiltration, sabotage, reconnaissance, and more. What was this unit called?
The Jaeger Corps.
Yes. Bonus question. What symbol did they wear identifying their status in the Special Forces unit? Extra credit.
An eagle? A bird?
It was just a maroon beret with a brass emblem
No.
featuring a hunter's bugle.
All right.
That question
not
didn't
get the
count.
extra
You
credit.
still got that one right. And your final question. Prior to its announcement, the car was originally called the Chevrolet Panther, but once it debuted as the Camaro, no one really knew what the name meant. Where does the name Camaro come from?
Oh, God.
Not much of a car guy, huh?
No, I'm not. I have no idea. My dad could probably answer this, but I have no idea. I'm going to ask him this tomorrow to see if he knows.
Well, the official company explanation when it debuted in 1966 was that it was an old French slang term for camaraderie and friendship. Although
Wow, I would never have guessed that.
some of the GM brass told the press that it's a small, vicious animal that eats Mustangs.
Of course. That's definitely just propaganda.
Later on, these legends grew to include a rare disease that kills horses, or, Mustangs.
Jesus.
In reality, it's just a unique name that met Chevrolet's main requirement of starting with the letter C, like Corvette, Chevelle, Corvair. Not real creative.
What did I drive? Cobalt. Okay, that meets a C. My first car, I
Cavalier.
can't even remember. Cavalier, thank you.
I was thinking,
That was my first
how
car.
awesome would the story be? I mean, this is an awesome story anyway. How much better would it have been if this was like a souped up Cavalier or like a Chevy Malibu?
I mean, an old Malibu would have been a little cooler than a Cavalier. I feel like the Cavalier just wouldn't have looked as good. I almost feel like the United States Air Force guys would have just laughed at him and told him to go away. But cool nonetheless. I would love to see a beat up old Chevy Cavalier with like tank armor driving around Bosnia.
Then you wouldn't have wrecked that car.
As I did most of my cars.
Or you would have just wrecked the other car.
I'd like to restate, I'm not a car guy.
All right. Well, that was
right, 1 of 3. I'll take it.
a fun one, minus, the first half of this episode. Just everyone skip right to about, 31 minutes, and
30 minutes. 30 minutes will get you past the bad part.
then it's fun.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for listening to this week's History's B-Side.
We'll see you guys next week.
History's B-Side is an independent, listener-supported podcast.
Leave us a review or subscribe to the show on your favorite podcasting service, and follow along on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at History's B-Side.
Send us your feedback or inquire about sponsorship and advertising opportunities by emailing us at historiesbside@gmail.com.
You can support the show by visiting anchor.fm/historiesbside.
This episode was researched and produced by your hosts, Matt Melito
And Phil Hall. Thanks for listening to History's B-Side.